Welcome back to the deep dive. We take complex sources, pull them apart, and give you the core insights you need. Today, we're tackling something really fundamental. It's about leadership, but maybe not in the way you usually think about it. How does a leader create something that truly lasts? Something that doesn't just, fade away when they're gone, but actually gets stronger. And we're not really talking about just personal success here or like how charismatic someone was. The real focus is on successful succession, building leaders, not just collecting followers.
That's a critical distinction, yeah.
Eh.
Especially if you're looking at, well, anything with longevity, a company, a community movement, whatever. You see plenty of leaders who are brilliant now. But real greatness, that seems to be about designing the future, making sure it works after you. And the sources we're digging into today, they give us a framework by looking at a specific historical example. We're looking at the leadership development model of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Specifically, how he systematically grew leaders. A whole generation of them, really. Not just people waiting for orders.
And the connection to today feels, well, it feels urgent, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Our sources really stress this point, that this historical approach has some pretty profound lessons for, modern companies, communities,
Yeah.
especially now with technology changing everything so fast and all the ethical questions popping up around AI. It feels like we need that stability, that ethical core more than ever.
Absolutely. And the core idea of the thesis we're kind of working from today, it's powerful but also quite simple. It basically says a leader's true measure isn't just their own list of accomplishments. It's the strength, the vision, the capability of the people who come after them. It's about building something that outlives you,
Right.
fundamentally.
Right. So our mission today for you listening is to really unpack the how, the specific methods used to make this kind of regenerative leadership happen. We want to tackle three main questions. First, how did Prophet Muhammad make sure he was building real independent leaders, not just encouraging blind obedience?
Hmm.
Second, what were the actual techniques? The scalable things that turn companions into thinkers, reformers, people with vision.
The practical stuff.
Exactly. And finally, the big one. How can you, maybe you're running a startup, leading a community group, managing a team, how can you take this model and actually use it today? How do you build that continuous succession?
Okay, so let's start with the end result. Because, the proof is in the pudding, right? When the prophet passed away, historically speaking, that should have been, well, a potential disaster for the community, a huge crisis point.
Absolutely. Losing that kind of foundational unifying figure, it often leads to collapse or fragmentation.
But that's not what happened. The mission didn't just survive. It stabilized. It grew. It expanded dramatically. I mean, that kind of continuity after losing the central figure is actually pretty rare in history when you look closely.
Yep.
And what's really striking, looking at the sources, is that this resilience wasn't just luck. It wasn't just leftover momentum or, lingering charisma. It seems to have been the direct result of very deliberate long-term planning. Years, decades of it. He didn't just leave like one or two designated successors. He left behind a whole layer of leadership. Senior figures, sure, but also administrators, commanders, legal minds.
Yeah.
People ready to step into really demanding roles almost immediately.
Yeah, and that feels like the core difference between, say, building a personal brand versus building a lasting culture. You see it today, right? These high-profile companies or movements built entirely around one founder.
Or the founder dependency model.
Exactly. And when that founder leaves, the whole thing often wobbles or even collapses because everything was wired to rely on that one person.
Right. And the sources really emphasize that the goal here was precisely the opposite. It wasn't about dependency. It was about intentionally building thinkers, reformers, visionaries, making sure the community had genuine depth across all the necessary areas. Military stuff, administration, handling complex legal issues, community ethics, you name it. The whole system was designed to be rich in leadership potential.
So it sounds like the culture itself was almost the succession plan. The expectation wasn't just wait for orders. It was more like everyone has a responsibility here.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. If you want something that lasts, that regenerates, you have to embed leadership development into the culture. It means you have to be committed to actively making other people capable, maybe even more capable than yourself in certain areas. And critically, giving them the confidence and the tools to operate on their own. That kind of intentionality, building that culture, is just far more durable than relying on one person's force of will, however strong it might be.
Okay, so if that's the goal, building this culture, how do they actually do it? How do you make that intention real? The first big principle our sources point to is this idea of, well, we're calling it radical trust. specifically trusting people, often younger individuals, with really significant high-stakes responsibilities. The idea being that's the fastest way to make them grow.
Yeah, radical trust. It works because it forces people to become capable.
Mhm.
It's different from just delegating tasks. When you delegate a task, you're just shifting workload, right? But
Mhm.
when you delegate real authority and, crucially, the accountability that goes with it for a major outcome, that's different. It turbocharges their development. They're suddenly forced to think systemically, use ethical judgment, solve problems creatively,
Uh-huh.
often under pressure.
Okay, let's look at an example. The sources talk about governance and diplomacy, specifically sending Mu'adh ibn Jabal to Yemen. And Yemen wasn't some backwater posting, right? It was complex, politically diverse, different tribes, existing legal systems.
Exactly. A really challenging assignment. And Mu'adh wasn't just sent as, like, an envoy or a messenger. He was sent as a full governor. He had administrative power, judicial power, religious authority. Think about what that means. He's responsible for integrating this whole complex region into the community's structure.
Mm.
And the prophet knew, Mu'adh couldn't exactly send a text message every time a tricky legal question came up.
Which leads to that really key conversation before he left, doesn't it? Where the prophet asks him essentially, how are you going to make decisions?
Right. And Mu'adh's answer is just. It's a perfect illustration of leadership accountability.
Yeah.
He basically says, okay, first I'll look at the foundational text, the Quran, the Sunnah. But, he says, if I can't find a direct answer there, I'll use my own judgment, my own reasoning based on the principles I know. This process, Ijtihad, it's not just winging it. It's a structured way of applying core principles to new situations.
And the prophet's response was to affirm that, to basically say, yes, that's the right approach.
That's empowerment right there, isn't it? Trusting someone not just to follow rules, but to apply a methodology, to think critically when faced with something new. In today's world, that's like decentralizing decision-making, pushing it down to the people who actually have the local knowledge.
Exactly that. And think about modern organizations. How often do you see talented mid-level people who know their stuff technically, but they have no real authority to make a call?
All the time, everything gets kicked upstairs.
Right. Creates bottlenecks, slows everything down. The lesson from Mu'adh seems to be, if you trust their character and you trust they understand the fundamentals, you have to trust their judgment on the ground when new problems arise.
Okay, so that's trust in administrative judgment. But the sources give an even more, maybe, startling example when it comes to military command and trusting youth. The case of Usama ibn Zaid. Ah, yes. This one really challenges modern assumptions about experience and age, I think. Usama ibn Zaid was appointed commander of a really important military expedition.
Hmm.
Strategic significance, going towards the Byzantine frontier. And he was, what, 17? 18 years old.
Yeah, incredibly young. And this wasn't just some minor scouting party. The army he was leading included some of the most senior, respected companions, people like Abu Bakr, Umar, men who'd fought in major battles.
Veterans.
Exactly. And understandably, this decision caused, well, some serious pushback. People were concerned, right? His age seemed like a huge risk for such a critical command.
Absolutely. There were murmurs, doubts, but the prophet's response was decisive. He stood by the appointment. He essentially overruled the concerns about age and experience, implicitly saying potential and character mattered more in this instance. Just think about the internal dynamics of that. It risked upsetting senior figures, potentially hurting morale.
Yeah.
Yet the long-term goal, validating Usama's capability, accelerating his growth, showing trust in the next generation, was clearly seen as more important.
It really flies in the face of how we often operate in, say, the corporate world, that deep-seated bias that you need decades of experience before you can really lead. We often wait until someone's in their late 40s or 50s to give them that kind of major responsibility, sometimes well past their peak creative or energetic years.
And the lesson here, it's kind of a tough one for organizations today. It suggests that if you're genuinely serious about building leaders for the future, you have to be willing to take calculated risks on young talent. Empower them early. You need to accept they might make mistakes initially, provide support, sure, but also publicly back them. Defend that trust you've placed in them, even when others doubt. Because placing that kind of significant, visible trust, it almost compels them to grow into the role. It's arguably the most powerful leadership accelerator there is.
Okay, so radical trust and delegation is one pillar. But what about the actual training? It wasn't just about throwing people in the deep end, was it? The sources really highlight the prophet's role as being more than just, say, a religious leader focused on rituals. He was also a teacher of wisdom, a mentor focused on character.
That's absolutely key. It's about developing the whole person, not just teaching a specific skill. Think about the difference today between like teaching someone coding versus teaching them about ethical AI development, stakeholder communication, how to handle pressure.
Right, the soft skills versus the technical.
Exactly. Those soft skills maybe undersells it. It's about character, wisdom, ethical grounding. If you just train a manager on supply chain optimization, okay, they're a technician. Maybe an algorithm replaces them eventually. But if you cultivate their ethical judgment, their resilience, their ability to make wise decisions under ambiguity, now you're building a sustainable leader.
And the scope of the training described in the sources seems to back this up. It wasn't just theology or religious practice. Companions were learning about administration, law, diplomacy. These are practical, hard skills needed to run a complex, growing community and deal with other powers.
Yes, and this brings us to a crucial point from the analysis. You need both. For leadership to be sustainable, development has to cover the technical skills and the ethical framework. You can't really separate them effectively in the long run. A leader who's technically brilliant but ethically flawed or who lacks resilience, they'll eventually undermine the trust and the culture they're meant to build.
So it's not just about knowing how to do something like negotiate a deal.
Right.
It's about understanding why you should do it ethically, even if cutting corners looks tempting.
Precisely. So if you translate this to today's leadership development, it argues for a much more integrated approach. The sources suggest we need structured mentorship, really intentional guidance from experienced leaders walking alongside newer ones through complex, real-world ethical challenges. And this needs to be paired with deep, ongoing values education, not just a one-off workshop.
That structure sounds important, not just leaving it to chance, like, oh, maybe they'll pick it up.
Definitely not. It needs structure. Think about, say, a senior person guiding a junior manager through a tough personnel decision, or a complex negotiation like Mu'ad might have faced. Not just giving the answer, but walking them through the process of reasoning from first principles. That IGTI methodology again. How do you apply our core values to this specific, messy situation? Especially now, with automation increasing, the real value add of human leaders becomes that nuanced judgment, that ethical application based on character. That's where the investment needs to go, strengthening that ethical backbone, that wisdom, not just focusing on the quarterly targets.
All right, so we have trust, delegation, holistic training. But if the goal is independent leaders, you can't have a culture of just nodding along. This next pillar seems vital. Actively encouraging critical thinking, dialogue, and consultation, the principle of shura. It sounds like it's explicitly designed against creating blind followers.
That's exactly right. True leadership in this model doesn't just put up with questions or input. It actively seeks it out, even demands it. Think about it. A leader who only surrounds themselves with people who agree with them, they're building fragility into the system.
An echo chamber.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Any blind spots the leader has just get amplified.
Right.
So to build capable successors, you have to actively cultivate their ability to think independently and critically, to question, to challenge respectfully.
So shura, it's more than just having an open door policy then. It sounds more formalized, like it's built into the process.
It is. It's understood as a process where the leader, even one receiving divine guidance on certain matters, is expected to solicit detailed input from the community, especially from those with relevant expertise on practical matters, things like administration, strategy, legal applications. And the process allows, even encourages, someone to challenge the leader's initial plan if they have better information or a stronger argument based on shared principles. It's about stress testing the decision collectively.
Which brings us to that classic example from the sources, the Battle of Badr, a really early, critical moment. The Prophet had chosen a spot for the camp.
Yes, and a companion, Al-Hubab ibn al-Mundir, comes forward. And he doesn't just say, I disagree. He asks us a very specific, very pointed question. If you translate it to a modern meeting, it's like asking the CEO, is this decision based on market data and strategic analysis, or is it more of a gut feeling? Or in this case, is this based on divine instruction, or is it your human judgment on strategy?
That's a crucial distinction. It forces clarity on the source of the decision.
Exactly. Yeah. And when the Prophet confirmed it was his strategic judgment, not divine revelation, Al-Hubab then laid out his counter-argument. He basically said, strategically, this spot isn't ideal. We should move up, control the water sources, deny them to the enemy. He had superior tactical insight in that moment.
And the key part is what happened next. The Prophet didn't just listen politely.
No, he accepted the advice. He acknowledged the superior reasoning and moved the entire army based on his companion's input.
The takeaway seems obvious. The leader showed humility and prioritized the best idea over their own initial judgment. But let me push on that a bit. Doesn't consistently taking advice from subordinates risk undermining the leader's authority over time? How does the model handle that tension between collective wisdom and the need for clear command?
That's a fair question. I think the way it works here is that it actually validates a different kind of authority. The leader's authority isn't based on pretending to be infallible. It's based on the wisdom to recognize and utilize the best expertise available, wherever it comes from. By accepting Al-Hubab's better plan, the Prophet demonstrated confidence, not weakness. It showed respect for expertise and strengthened the team's trust in the process and in their own ability to contribute meaningfully. It builds collective ownership.
Okay, that makes sense. It flips the idea of authority leading by respecting the best idea, not just the rank. So let's connect this practice, this shura, this culture of critical thinking to today, especially this AI era you mentioned earlier. What's the link?
The sources draw a really interesting line here. As AI and algorithms increasingly handle tasks, even complex decision-making support, the unique and irreplaceable role of the human leader shifts more towards ethical oversight, auditing the why behind the AI's recommendation, not just the what. Now, if leaders are only trained to follow instructions, which is essentially how an algorithm operates, following its programming, they risk just rubber stamping potentially flawed or biased AI outputs without critical examination.
Ah, I see. So the sure training, that habit of questioning, of asking, is this the right approach, becomes a kind of human safeguard against automated errors or biases.
Exactly that. Think about an AI used for loan applications that learns bias from historical data and starts unfairly denying loans to certain groups. A leader trained just to execute will say, well, the system says no. But a leader trained in Shura, in critical ethical inquiry, will ask, hang on, why is the system saying no? What data is it using? What are the potential downstream consequences of this automated decision? Is it just? Is it fair?
Hmm.
That critical thinking, the ability to question the ethics of the algorithm, not just its efficiency, that becomes absolutely essential. We need more leaders trained to engage in that kind of deep moral scrutiny of the technologies we're deploying.
Okay, so leaders need to be trusted, mentored, and encouraged to think critically. But what about when things go wrong? Because they inevitably do. Any long-term project faces setbacks. How did this model train people to handle adversity, to resist that urge for quick fixes or getting discouraged by immediate results?
This ties into another core principle: cultivating patience and a genuinely long-term perspective. It's tough because everything in our modern work environment kind of pushes the other way, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Quarterly reports, instant metrics, social media.
Constant feedback loops, yeah. Conditions us for short-term thinking.
Right, so this model seems to have actively worked against that, training leaders to see beyond the immediate win or loss, and to sometimes accept short-term pain for a much larger strategic advantage down the road.
And how do you train for that? You can't just tell people, be patient. It seems the leader has to guide the team through experiences where the immediate feeling is negative, but the underlying strategy is sound. The classic example here is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah.
Yes, Hudaybiyah. The context is so important. The Prophet and his companions were traveling to Mecca for pilgrimage, a deeply important religious and emotional goal for them, but they were stopped before reaching Mecca by their adversaries, the Quraysh, and the treaty they ended up signing. Well, on the surface, it looked like a total defeat to many of the companions present.
The sources really capture that feeling, don't they? A sense of shock, even humiliation. They felt they were giving in. What were the specific terms that felt so bad?
A couple of things really stung. First, they couldn't complete their pilgrimage that year. They had to turn back. Mission failed, essentially, for that immediate goal. Second, and this was maybe even harder for many to swallow, was a clause about refugees or converts. It said if someone from Mecca became Muslim and fled to the Prophet's community in Medina, they had to be sent back to Mecca. But if a Muslim from Medina renounced their faith and fled to Mecca, the Meccans did not have to return them. It seemed completely one-sided, strategically and morally disadvantageous.
You can see why people were upset. The sources even mention senior figures like Umar openly questioning the decision. Why accept this? We're strong enough to fight. It really shows how hard it was for them to see past the immediate perceived injustice.
And that struggle, that tension, is the learning moment. Because what seemed like a terrible setback was actually, with hindsight, a brilliant strategic pivot. That treaty secured something far more valuable in the long run than completing the pilgrimage that specific year. It secured peace, a 10-year truce.
10 years of non-aggression. Why was that the game changer?
Because peace fundamentally altered the whole situation. It meant the community was no longer defined primarily by conflict. It provided recognition, stability. This allowed them to focus inward, consolidate, organize, grow peacefully. Critically, it opened the door for dialogue and outreach to other tribes who had previously been wary or hostile because of the ongoing conflict. The sources suggest that in the 2 years following that treaty, the community's influence and numbers grew exponentially, far more than years of fighting had achieved. The peace dividend was enormous.
Wow. So the leadership lesson is about cultivating that ability within your team to hold on to a long-term vision, even when the present looks bleak. To understand that sometimes a temporary difficulty isn't failure, it's a necessary step towards a bigger win you can't quite see yet.
Exactly. And it takes real leadership maturity to absorb the team's immediate disappointment, manage that emotional fallout, maybe even absorb criticism yourself,
Mm.
while staying absolutely focused on the long-term strategic prize. When you develop leaders who get that resilience, it isn't just about bouncing back quickly, but sometimes about having the strategic patience to let a multi-year plan unfold. That's how you build something that can weather real storms.
Okay, we've got the pillars, this radical trust, the holistic mentorship, critical consultation or sure, and that long-term resilient vision. Now let's look at the ultimate test, what happened right after the prophet passed away. Did the system work? The sources seem clear. Despite the immense shock and potential for chaos, there was continuity. Challenged, yes, but the community held together.
It really seems the system performed as intended. It prevented a total power vacuum or collapse. Yes, the succession process itself was intense, emotionally charged, debated, but the underlying principles, consultation, established trust, recognized capability, provided a framework. The community relatively quickly came together around a successor, Abu Bakr, based on his long-standing relationship, his proven character, and his recognized leadership abilities.
And we should probably mention those immediate successors, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. May God be pleased with them all. Often called the Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs. They stepped into incredibly difficult situations, didn't they? Especially Abu Bakr right at the start.
Absolutely. Abu Bakr didn't inherit a calm situation. He faced immediate crises, the shock of the prophet's death, and then the Ridda Wars, where some tribes challenged the central authority, a potential disintegration. Yet he was able to mobilize the community, maintain focus, and basically stabilize the state within a couple of years. That speaks volumes about the leadership capacity that had already been built. These weren't people learning on the job in a crisis. They were prepared.
And a really crucial point the analysis makes is about the differences between these leaders. They weren't clones.
That's perhaps one of the most important insights. They each brought unique strengths to the role. Abu Bakr is remembered for his steadiness, his calm resolve in that initial crisis. Umar, famously for his incredible administrative skill, his sense of justice, building the institutions of the state. Uthman was known for his generosity and perhaps organizational capacity in compiling the Quran. Ali for his deep wisdom, his courage, his eloquence and legal knowledge. They led with distinct styles, reflecting their individual characters and strengths, yet all within the same ethical framework.
So the system wasn't designed to churn out copies of the founder. It was designed to identify and elevate diverse talents, allowing each person's unique excellence to flourish.
Precisely. Which confirms that the goal wasn't replicating a single personality. It was about fostering a resilient culture that could produce various types of high-caliber leaders as needed. And the lesson for today seems pretty clear. Truly effective leaders don't create systems where everyone depends on them. They build cultures and structures where leadership naturally regenerates itself. A genuine pipeline, ensuring things continue strongly, regardless of who's in the top spot at any given moment.
Which puts the responsibility squarely back on current leaders, doesn't it? The mandate is to be actively building that pipeline now.
Yes, proactively investing in the next generation. And that means trusting them now, finding the muads and nusamas in our own organizations, giving them real responsibility, high stakes, mentoring them through the ethical challenges, demanding critical thought through consultation, not just giving them a checklist to follow. Succession planning, viewed this way, isn't just about writing a name in a sealed envelope. It's about the culture of development you build over years, even decades. Hashtag summary and key takeaways.
Wow. Okay, so we've journeyed through quite a bit here. History, leadership theory, practical application. We've really unpacked these core ideas: radical trust, that holistic mentorship, the importance of critical consultation, and this need for visionary patience.
Yeah, and if we boil it all down, the source analysis points to 4 really critical takeaways for anyone thinking about leadership today. First, remember the ultimate purpose of this model. It wasn't just about effective management, it was about building torchbearers. Leaders guided primarily by faith and justice, with skills serving that higher purpose.
Okay, purpose first.
Second, the engine driving this is that combination of radical trust, deep mentorship, and genuine consultation. Sure, they have to work together. You can't really pick and choose if you want the full effect.
Right, it's a system.
Third, the definition of success shifts.
Right.
It's not about how indispensable you are. It's about creating continuity, building a culture that outlasts you. If everything falls apart when you leave, maybe you haven't truly succeeded in this sense.
That's a challenging thought.
And finally, looking forward, especially with AI, the need is for leaders who can weave together faith, ethics, and vision. We need people trained not just to use the tools, but to constantly ask the ethical questions, to provide that human wisdom and moral clarity as a check on purely automated processes. Hashtag tag outro.
So as we wrap up, we really want you to take these ideas and think about how they apply in your own world. Not just interesting history, but actionable principles.
Definitely. So maybe a few points for reflection. First, thinking about Muad and Usama, who is one person you could truly empower this week. Not just give a task, but delegate real decision-making authority, something with actual stakes to accelerate their growth.
Second, take an honest look at your own leadership style. Thinking about Shara, are you cultivating dependency where people just wait for your direction? Or are you actively building empowerment where people feel safe and even obligated to think critically and challenge assumptions respectfully?
Third, consider Hudaybiyah. Where are you facing a short-term difficulty right now in your work, maybe even personally, that might actually be necessary for a much bigger long-term strategic win? Can you help your team or yourself see that larger picture and maintain patience?
And finally, inspired by the continuity after the prophet, maybe commit to starting a real succession plan, not just thinking who's next, but how am I building the system and developing the people so that my role, whether professional or even familial, can transition smoothly and effectively. It starts with trusting and challenging people today.
You know, we've talked a lot about radical trust and that long-term vision. Both really push against the grain of how things often work today, the speed, the focus on immediate wins. So the question we want to leave you with is this. What do you find the single most difficult principle to actually put into practice in your own environment? Is it having the resilience to stick to a vision during a painful setback like Hudaybiyah? Or is it finding the courage to place that radical trust in the potential of someone younger or less experienced like the Usama? Something to reflect on.
That's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into building a legacy of leadership. We hope you found it valuable, and we encourage you to keep exploring these powerful ideas. Until next time.